the sky.
Look at this strong woman, who offers a silver arm ring. 50. Do I hear 60? Sold to the merchant for 70.
We sing you to the shore. We honor you forevermore.
She had a name, the Arab chronicler, watching through the tent fabric on the banks of the Volga River, in 922 never wrote it down. He recorded her age, approximately 19. He recorded that she had served the dead chieftain. He recorded that she had volunteered. He recorded with increasing vagueness what happened to her inside that tent in the hour before she burned. He never wrote her name. That omission was not accidental. It was the entire system, expressed in a single act of record keeping. She was not a person whose name deserved preservation. She was property whose function deserved documentation. The difference between those two things is the difference between history and erasure, and for 500,000 women across 3 centuries of Viking expansion, erasure was the deliberate, institutional, economically motivated choice. This is the history that the longships carried in their holds, not just the raiding and the exploring and the trading that fills the museums and the television series. The other cargo, the one nobody puts on the tourist brochure. To understand what the Viking Age actually was for the women inside it, you have to start not with the ships or the warriors, but with the economics. Because what the Norse built between roughly 793 and 1100 CE was not simply a raiding culture, it was a supply chain, a sophisticated, geographically vast, legally codified, multi-generational supply chain for human beings, and women were its primary commodity. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan documented what he witnessed on the Volga in 922, with the careful precision of a man trying to record what he was seeing while managing his own horror at it. The funeral of a Rus Viking chieftain. The ceremony had been building for 10 days. When the chieftain died, his female slaves were gathered and asked who would follow their master into the afterlife. The word asked requires examination, because the asking was not optional in any functional sense. These women understood that someone would be selected regardless. Volunteering meant controlling nothing, except the illusion of choice. Refusing meant being selected anyway, with the additional punishment of having demonstrated reluctance. Within the framework of that choice, the girl we are calling Sigrid stepped forward. She was 19. She had been captured from a Slavic village 2 years earlier, during a raid that ended her previous life as completely as a fire ends a building. She had learned enough Norse in captivity to function, to understand commands, to perform whatever was required of her. She had watched other women move through the slave economy around her, sold, traded, used, discarded, and she had watched her own position in that economy deteriorate as younger captives arrived and her relative value declined. When she stepped forward, she may have been choosing the timing of her own death over its method. That is the framework within which her choice existed, not freedom versus obligation, but this death versus that death, now versus later, with ceremony versus without. For 10 days after her selection, Sigrid existed in a suspended state between life and death that Ibn Fadlan documented with uneasy fascination. She was given better food than she had eaten in 2 years of captivity. She was given strong drink, a mixture that Norse sources suggest included fermented honey, hallucinogenic herbs, and substances that prevented complete unconsciousness while maintaining a state of functional compliance. She was given new clothing. She was guarded continuously, never left alone, never permitted the possibility of escape or self-harm that might disrupt the ceremony's choreography. Each morning, she was lifted onto a platform where she was required to proclaim visions of the afterlife. "I see my master," she called out. "He calls me to his hall." The crowd cheered. The visions confirmed their chieftain's presence in Valhalla. The drink was working as designed. On nights 4 through 6, warriors from the chieftain's inner circle visited the tent where Sigrid was housed. Ibn Fadlan describes this with the deliberate vagueness of a man writing for an audience he knows will understand the implication. Each warrior, upon emerging, announced that he had done this out of love for his dead leader. The crowd outside sang loudly during these visits to cover any sounds that might escape the tent. On the 10th day, Sigrid was dressed in the finest clothes she had ever worn. Gold arm rings marked her as chosen. She was lifted onto the funeral ship, where the chieftain's preserved body lay, surrounded by weapons, animals, and the accumulated wealth meant to accompany him into the next world. She drank from 3 ceremonial cups. By the third, she required support from 2 women to remain upright. Then she entered the tent erected on the ship's deck. 6 warriors were waiting. The same 6. The singing outside grew louder. When the 6th warrior emerged, the old woman the crowd called the Angel of Death entered the tent with a rope and a broad blade. 2 women held Sigrid's hands. 2 men held her feet. The rope went around her neck. It took several minutes. The blade was driven between her ribs for certainty. Her body was placed beside the chieftain. Fire arrows ignited the oil-soaked wood. By sunset, the ship was ash, and the crowd had dispersed, satisfied that their chieftain had departed for Valhalla in appropriate style. Ibn Fadlan wrote it all down. He never wrote her name, because she didn't have one in his record. She was a function in a ceremony. She was property completing its final service. But to understand why that ship existed, why that ceremony was possible, why that economy had developed the infrastructure to deliver a 19-year-old Slavic girl to a riverbank on the Volga, to die in service to a dead man, you have to go back to the beginning, to a dawn in June of 793, on a small island off the coast of Northumbria, the monastery at Lindisfarne. Sister Aldred was copying manuscripts in the scriptorium when the sounds began, sounds she had no framework for, because nothing in 12 years of contemplative religious life had prepared her for what Norse raiders entering a monastery actually sounded like. She hid in the grain storage. Through cracks in the wooden wall, she watched what happened to the women who didn't hide in time. She watched the Vikings sort through the captured with what she would later describe, if she survived to describe anything, as the efficiency of farmers sorting livestock. The categories were immediate and practical. Young and healthy women went to one group. Older but still strong women went to another. The elderly and the sick received quick deaths where they fell, because they had no trade value, and occupied space that moving captives would need. Her friend Bridget, whose auburn hair caught the morning light during prayers, and had always seemed to Aldred like a kind of gift from God, was dragged toward the beach by that hair. Aldred was found when a warrior's hand plunged into the grain beside her, and found her arm. He spoke something in Norse she didn't understand, and shoved her toward the growing line. The ship journey to Norway took 11 days, 40 women in a space designed for 20. No food for the first 2 days. Water from whatever moisture could be licked from the wooden hull, after waves broke over the side. By the 5th day, 2 women had died. Their bodies went overboard without ceremony, because dead merchandise occupied space and generated nothing. When they reached Norway, the division happened immediately. The raid leader chose first 6 women, including Bridget. His warriors chose next, in order of reputation and valor, demonstrated in battle. Aldred, whose name was already being forgotten in the process of becoming property, went to a farmer named Gunnar, who needed field labor. She would spend 20 years grinding grain on Gunnar's farm. Her hands would deform from the repetitive motion, the joints thickening and distorting, until her fingers looked like something that had grown wrong. Her back would curve permanently, from carrying loads the human spine was not designed to carry across 2 decades. She would die in Norway, having never learned what happened to Bridget after that first selection. What happened to Bridget was this. She lasted 3 months in the chieftain's hall, before being sold to a trader moving east. From that point she entered the vast Eastern trade network that connected Scandinavian raid sites to markets in Constantinople, Baghdad and Byzantium. She became a transaction in a supply chain. Then she became a footnote. Then she became nothing, the way property becomes nothing when it stops being recorded. The morning after a successful raid on a Frankish village, a chieftain named Ragnar, the sagas are full of men with this name, which is part of the problem, walked between rows of captured women, arranged by his men in the temporary camp. 200 women kneeling in the mud, their village still smoking behind them. He carried a staff to lift chins and turn faces toward the light. He sorted them into 3 groups with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times. The first group he called laborers, women whose hands showed agricultural work, whose build suggested physical endurance, whose age placed them in the productive years between youth and decline. They would grind grain, carry water, maintain the household machinery, until their bodies stopped, 8 to 12 years on average, based on what the sagas record about thrall lifespans, under heavy agricultural labor. The second group was breeders, healthy young women of childbearing age. Their purpose was multiplication. The Viking slave economy ran partly on reproduction, with children born to enslaved women automatically inheriting their mother's status. Every child born to a thrall woman was another thrall. The system reproduced itself through the bodies of its captives. The third group Ragnar called his special purposes. These were the beautiful, the young, the nobly born. They were investments. They would be fed better than the others, taught phrases in Arabic and Greek and Byzantine court language, trained in presentation, and transported east to the great markets where their specific qualities commanded specific prices. A 30-year-old farmer's wife named Marie, whose 4 children had watched Vikings cut down their father in the doorway, went to the laborer group. Her hands told Ragnar everything he needed to know about her value and her expected duration of service. A 16-year-old daughter of a minor nobleman named Isabel, whose father had tried to organize resistance and paid for it immediately, went to the breeders. Within a month she would understand what that categorization meant in daily practice. Within a year she would give birth. Over the following decade, she would produce 7 children, all born into slavery, all redistributed as soon as they were old enough to work. The Viking economy ran on this arithmetic. A 20-year-old woman named Marguerite, whose features remained striking even through tears and mud, was cleaned, fed, and prepared for transport east. She was an investment being readied for market, and every element of her presentation affected the price she would command. This selection process was replicated across hundreds of raids each year for 3 centuries. The Vikings developed expertise in human evaluation that was as sophisticated as any livestock market in the medieval world. They could determine approximate age from teeth, work capacity from hands, breeding potential from physical assessment, ethnic origin from features, and they knew which ethnicities commanded premium prices in which markets. Frankish women brought good prices in Ireland, Irish women were valued in Iceland, Slavic women commanded the highest prices in Byzantine and Islamic markets. The auction block in Dublin stood 15 feet high to ensure visibility for the hundreds of buyers crowding the market square. By 852, Dublin had become the western headquarters of Viking human trafficking, processing thousands of women annually through holding pens that could maintain 500 at a time. Feeding operations provided minimal sustenance to preserve value without excessive cost. Medical personnel, such as medicine was, isolated sick women to prevent epidemics that would destroy inventory. A Welsh woman the sources call Branwen had been sold 16 times in 2 years. The constant movement was deliberate policy. Women who stayed in one location developed connections, learned the local geography, identified allies, became in the most dangerous possible sense human to the people around them. The trade kept them in perpetual motion, always displaced, always foreign, always without the accumulated knowledge of place that made resistance possible. An Irish princess named Orlaith stood naked on the Dublin auction platform, while a trader speaking 4 languages described her qualities to Byzantine merchants, Moorish traders, Norse settlers, and local Irish collaborators who had decided that profiting from the suffering of their own people was preferable to sharing it. Her noble lineage was a selling point. Her education was a selling point. The bidding opened at 12 marks of silver and ended at 24, paid by a specialist in high-value Eastern transport. Orlaith would travel through Sweden, down Russian rivers, and eventually reach Baghdad, where her white skin and red hair made her an exotic curiosity in a wealthy household. She would likely never be seen again by anyone from the world she had come from. She would disappear into the private geography of a wealthy man's household, her existence documented only in the trade records that noted her sale. The price variations at Dublin and the other great markets, Hedeby in Denmark, Novgorod in the east, reveal the precise commodification of human women that the Viking economy had achieved. A virgin between 14 and 18 brought 20 marks. The same woman after that status changed, dropped to 12. A woman over 25 brought 8 marks absent specialized skills. A woman over 35 brought 4 marks. Pregnancy brought 15 marks. The buyer was purchasing potential additional property alongside the existing merchandise. Skills created premium tiers. A woman who could weave brought 3 times the price of one who couldn't. A woman who could illuminate manuscripts might bring 30 marks from institutions seeking to continue their work. A woman with medical knowledge brought 40 marks or more. Musical ability could double the base price. 3 ships arrived weekly during trading season, each carrying 30 to 60 women. The logistics required extensive coordination, provisions, security, medical knowledge to minimize transit losses, networks for identifying buyers, and matching specific women to specific markets. The Vikings had created the medieval world's most sophisticated human trafficking system, and it would not be matched in scale or sophistication until the Atlantic slave trade 7 centuries later. At the Great Law Assembly, the thing at Thingvellir in Iceland in 970, the law speaker stood on his rock platform and recited from memory the relevant sections of the Gragas law code concerning female thralls. His voice carried across the gathered crowd as he spoke words that had been refined over generations to achieve their purpose, the complete legal erasure of female humanity within a functioning juridical framework. A thrall woman's body belongs entirely to her master. She cannot refuse any use of her person. Her children belong to her master. She cannot own property. She cannot bear witness. She cannot seek compensation for any harm done to her. She exists outside the law except as her master's possession. These were not abstractions. They were operational daily realities for thousands of women across the Norse world. The case being adjudicated that day illustrated the system with terrible clarity. A man named Thorstein Redbeard had killed his neighbor's female thrall named Asa during a property dispute. His axe had reached for his neighbor and found her instead. The legal question before the assembly was not murder, it was property damage. The judgment required Thorstein to pay replacement value, 8 marks for a woman of approximately 20, who could weave. No further consequences, no consideration of the life ended. The record of Asa's death was functionally identical to the record of a sheep lost in a storm. Asa had been captured in Ireland 5 years earlier. She had learned Norse. She had adapted to Iceland's volcanic landscape and brutal winters. She had developed the weaving skills that made her valuable enough that her death required financial settlement. She had borne 2 children, both now serving in the same household. None of this had any legal significance. She was property that had been damaged. The owner was compensated. The case was closed. A provision the Gragas called the morning gift tradition allowed masters to lend female thralls to guests as hospitality gestures. The refusal of such loans was not legally possible. The woman was not party to the arrangement any more than furniture is party to being moved between rooms. Any children resulting from guest use automatically became the property of the woman's owner, regardless of the guest's status or the specific circumstances of conception. A woman named Ragnhild experienced this when her master hosted a gathering of 5 chieftains to negotiate a raiding alliance. For the week of the negotiations, she was passed among the guests nightly. By the meeting's end, she was pregnant. The child she bore 9 months later was nobody's son in any legal sense, everybody's property, in every practical sense, raised as a thrall with no identity beyond his mother's servitude. The inheritance laws created what might be called generational bondage, a mathematical impossibility of escape that functioned across lifetimes. A thrall woman's children were thralls, their children were thralls. The line continued until broken by death, the impossibly rare event of manumission, or the even rarer circumstance of an owner choosing to free an entire family line at considerable personal financial loss. 3 generations of women living in one Icelandic household around 960 illustrate what this looked like from the inside. The grandmother had been captured in Scotland and remembered freedom as a lived experience, a place and a time she could describe to her descendants in fragments. The mother had been born into slavery and knew freedom only as a concept, something her mother talked about the way people talk about places they've never been. The granddaughter could not imagine freedom at all. Slavery was not her condition, it was her identity. She did not think of herself as a person who happened to be enslaved. She thought of herself as a slave who happened to be person-shaped. The grandmother taught her descendants Scottish words in whispers, songs from before the capture, fragments of genealogy that proved their bloodline had not always been property. These linguistic treasures were hidden from masters, shared only in the specific intimacy of enslaved women among themselves, maintained across generations as proof that their humanity predated their servitude and would outlast it, even if they couldn't. The island slavery of Iceland created horrors specific to its geography. On a continent, escape meant reaching another jurisdiction. In Iceland, escape meant the ocean. A thrall named Ursa ran for 3 days across lava fields and volcanic rock, her feet destroying themselves against the terrain, until she reached the northern coast and understood what she was looking at. Water in every direction, no other land visible, no boats available, no knowledge of which direction led to anywhere survivable. The nearest land was Greenland, itself another frozen prison. When they recaptured her 2 days later, her punishment was calculated, with the precision that characterized all Viking dealings with slave resistance. Not death, which would waste her value, not mutilation of her hands or face, which would prevent work and reduce her price. They cut the tendons in her heels. The healing was engineered to be partial, enough to allow work, not enough to allow running. She would spend the rest of her life moving in a shuffling gait that announced to anyone who saw her what she had attempted and what it had cost her. Iceland's geography was a natural prison more effective than any walls. The interior was uninhabitable volcanic desert. The coasts were cliffs against violent seas. Between settlements stretched miles of terrain that would kill unprepared travelers in hours. Summer brought continuous daylight that made concealment impossible. Winter brought cold that killed in hours. The volcano Hekla was known as a site where desperate enslaved women ended their lives in fire rather than continue in chains, choosing incineration over what the alternative held. A mass escape attempt in 912 ended with 23 people dead at sea. They had coordinated across multiple farms, stolen 2 fishing boats, and attempted to reach Scotland. Neither boat had anyone aboard who understood ocean navigation. Both washed up on Iceland's southern shore weeks later. All 23 bodies were recovered by the sea, none by the land. In Greenland, the isolation was more complete still. 2 small settlements at the edge of the known world, requiring massive labor to survive in a landscape of ice and stone. Escape meant open ocean, in conditions that killed experienced sailors in large vessels. Female thralls there became communal property, in ways that exceeded even Iceland's systematic violations, passed between men nightly, shared like food or tools, their bodies functioning as resources for entire communities, rather than individual households. The wedding of Jarl Eric and Brianna took place in the same hall where her father's blood still stained the floor. 3 days had passed since Eric's warriors had broken through the gates of her family's Irish fortress. She had watched him personally separate her father's head from his body. Now she stood beside him in her dead mother's wedding dress, the fabric still carrying her mother's scent, while his men made jokes about taming the Irish and wagered on how long before she stopped fighting. Brianna was 17. Until 3 days ago, she had been preparing for a strategic marriage designed to unite 2 Irish kingdoms against Norse expansion. She could read Latin and speak 3 languages and managed her father's household accounts. These skills now made her more valuable, not as a person, but as a political instrument. Her marriage to Eric legitimized his claim to her family's lands. Every person in the hall understood the symbolism. The Irish nobility was being absorbed, literally consumed, through her body. The political logic was ruthlessly effective. By marrying noble daughters, Viking conquerors gained legitimate claims that pure military conquest could never provide. Local populations might resist foreign invaders indefinitely. They found it considerably harder to resist the children of their own noble bloodlines, even when those children were raised to celebrate their father's victory over their maternal heritage. The women became biological weapons in a war of cultural absorption that took generations to complete. Eric had killed Brianna's father, 2 brothers, and 6 male cousins. He had personally executed her uncle, after promising mercy. Now he would father children on her, children who would carry her bloodline's legitimacy, but be raised as Vikings, who would speak Norse primarily, and learn her language only as a tool for managing subjected populations, who would worship Norse gods while their mother secretly prayed to Christ. Modern genetic analysis of Icelandic populations confirms what the sagas tried to obscure. While 62% of male lineage in Iceland is Scandinavian, 63% of female lineage is Celtic, primarily Irish and Scottish. These percentages represent thousands of Briannas, women whose bodies were the mechanism through which Viking expansion achieved permanent genetic conquest. Iceland was not simply settled, it was populated through the systematic abduction and forced reproduction of women from the British Isles. The terrace system that supported and extended this economy was as calculated as the trade networks. After Viking raids, certain women, those who had witnessed the worst but not personally suffered the most extreme violations, were sometimes deliberately released. They became, without understanding their role, propaganda delivery mechanisms. Their testimony, more credible than Viking threats because it was first-hand, spread through kinship networks and religious communities faster than ships could sail. A single spectacular atrocity could empty entire regions before a raiding party arrived. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 used this systematically. After capturing York, it paused. It held the city while stories of what had happened to York's women traveled north through Northumbria. When the army finally marched, it found minimal resistance. Populations had already evacuated, rather than expose their women to what they had heard described. Even the boneless paraded captured noble women through territories he intended to conquer. Women still alive but visibly, obviously, permanently broken, as living warnings that traveled with the army, and did more work than any military threat. The economic mathematics were precise. For every woman actually enslaved, dozens of others fled potential enslavement, abandoning farms and households and tools and stored food that Vikings then took without combat. The terror multiplied the economic return of each actual raid by a factor that no military analyst has fully quantified, because the records of what was abandoned don't exist, only the records of what was taken. Against all of this, women resisted, in ways large and small, at costs that were almost always total. They resisted. Poison was the most accessible tool available to women who prepared food and drink. A woman named Deirdre, captured near Cork and brought to a Norwegian jarl's household as a brewing specialist, spent months gathering mushrooms from Norwegian forests, drying them, grinding them into powder, indistinguishable in appearance and scent from common spices, waiting for the right celebration, the right quantity of mead, the right moment when one more ingredient would pass unnoticed. On the night she chose, 12 warriors died before dawn. When they found her among the bodies, she made no attempt to hide or escape. They asked her nothing. She asked only one question, whether all 12 were dead. When told yes, she smiled. Her execution took 3 days. She never screamed, she never begged, she never expressed regret. That smile haunted the survivors longer than the deaths themselves. A Welsh woman named Sarah killed 3 successive masters over 5 years before the 4th grew suspicious. Each death appeared natural. The symptoms mimicked illness and organ failure, with sufficient variation to prevent pattern recognition, until the 4th victim arranged testing of his food. Her knowledge came from her father, who had been a healer before Vikings killed him. She was caught, but 3 men were dead, who would otherwise have lived, and the knowledge that any meal could be the last one created anxiety in Viking households that no law could fully suppress. In 943, a coordinated group of thralls burned the Hedeby slave market. They had gathered lamp oil in small quantities over months, hidden in different locations. On a night of strong western wind, they set fires simultaneously at 6 points around the market. 17 of the 20 women involved died in the flames they had set. 3 survived. The market was destroyed. They had chosen immolation over recapture, and they had made that choice with enough planning and coordination to ensure it accomplished something beyond their own deaths. Mothers committed infanticide rather than condemn newborns to the slavery they themselves inhabited. The sagas occasionally mentioned finding infants hidden in hay storage or weighted in streams, their mothers having made the calculation that grief was preferable to watching another generation enter the machinery. Norse law recorded these events as property destruction, requiring financial compensation to owners. No law could be constructed that was worse than what drove women to make that choice. A group of Irish women on a transport ship overpowered their guards, killed them with their own weapons, and attempted to sail the vessel back to Ireland. Most couldn't navigate and died at sea. 3 ships are recorded as having successfully returned to Irish waters, with escaped slaves aboard. 3 out of the hundreds that carried women east over 3 centuries. 3. The cultural resistance was quieter and more durable. Enslaved women taught their children their homeland languages in whispers, disguised home stories as Norse tales, maintained genealogies in songs that seemed innocuous, kept alive in the bodies and memories of their children the identity that their captors were trying to erase. This cultural preservation created identity fractures in children, who were supposed to be fully assimilated Vikings. It kept alive across generations the knowledge that these bloodlines had not always been property. The accounting is not complete. It never will be. Too many names were lost before anyone who might have preserved them survived long enough to try. Too many stories ended before anyone thought to write them down. Too many women passed through the markets, and the longships, and the grinding stones and the funeral ships, without leaving any record of having been anything other than a function in someone else's economy. But the DNA remembers. The genetic structure of Northern European populations carries evidence that saga literature deliberately obscured. Every Viking ship in every museum carried enslaved women. Every piece of gold in every exhibition was purchased with profits from selling Irish or Slavic or Frankish girls in distant markets. Every Norse settlement that became a modern nation was populated through forced reproduction by women who had no choice about any of it. Sigrid died on the Volga in 922. She was 19 years old. She had been enslaved for 2 years. She had a name that Ibn Fadlan never recorded, a family somewhere in a Slavic village that no longer existed as she had known it, a future that had been replaced by someone else's ceremonial requirements. The smoke from the burning ship carried her east across the river, while the crowd dispersed, satisfied with the ceremony's success. She was one of 500,000. The least we can do is say that number out loud. 500,000 women, over 3 centuries, the foundation on which Viking achievement was built, the invisible labor and violated bodies that funded the longships and the trade networks and the settlements and the exploration that we celebrate and romanticize and put on television. They deserved better than they received. They deserved better than the silence that followed. The least we can offer them now is the acknowledgement that they existed, that they mattered, that their suffering was not incidental to Viking civilization, but central to it, the engine that powered the golden age we remember, while forgetting what it cost. Remember them. That's exactly the kind of buried history that History Digger exists to uncover. If these forgotten voices matter to you the way they matter to us, subscribe, because there are hundreds more stories waiting, and they deserve to be told.